I have to walk you through a little bit of history to get you ready, and we will probably spend a lot less time talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity than you may have feared. We're going to start, although the story doesn't start here, but we're going to start with Karl Marx. And we're not going to dig deeply into Karl Marx. We're not going to get into Das Kapital. We're not going to do the whole thing. Marx had a couple of very important ideas, one of which was, very important ideas in terms of shaping the world, I should say. One of which was the idea that we shouldn't study society to understand it. We should study it to change it. Another of these ideas is what is known as conflict theory. That is that the world is separated into stratified groups, that's a technical term to mean something like classes or castes, and that those stratified groups are in a zero-sum conflict for the resources, opportunities, and power in society. There is no cooperation, there is no positive sum game. Positive sum is a fancy way to say all ships rise together. There's no mutual cooperation, which is a little funny given the goal of the communist utopia. The classes of society are in zero-sum conflict. And Marx put the locus of conflict theory on economics. He believed that if the workers could unite, workers of the world unite. That's the saying. If they could unite and seize the means of economic production, they could turn the ship of society toward the communist utopia. Details to be filled in on the other side of the gulag. Didn't work. Wasn't true. People noticed. In fact, people who are very relevant to this story, not just liberals, noticed. And so in the late 19-teens, going into the early 1920s, a group of people that eventually convened in Frankfurt, Germany, formed the School of Critical Theory, the Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research, as it was called. And they wanted to study why Marx was wrong. And they said, in a sense, following the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, that it's not, as it turns out, just economics. It's more complicated than that. Culture matters. And thus the things that prop up culture matters. Faith, family, the institutions of society, those matter. Those have to be subverted. That's where consciousness has to be raised to show that there are powerful entities in society who are creating conditions, systemic or structural conditions, under which other people are oppressed. So the oppressed have to be told that they're being fed culture by the elites, and that they are accepting that and internalizing their own oppression as natural, right, or the proper order of things. So we now have a shift. Some people have referred to this as cultural Marxism. This is a fraught term. It's a very complicated issue. There are multiple things that go by that name. Very skillfully was appended the idea of a conspiracy theory that's anti-Semitic, so it's very difficult to talk about cultural Marxism without falling into that trap. So it's best not to. It's best to say they applied conflict theory to culture, which is the same thing. They applied conflict theory to these various elements of culture into the cultural institutions, and you started to have different thinkers arise. So you had Theodor Adorno arise. He's looking at media. He's looking at propaganda. He's looking at how that was used to feed the elite culture into the common person and get them to accept their lives. You see this emergence of popular culture starting to happen in a little bit in the interwar, but especially in the post-war era, post-World War II. And they're very critical of this. In 1937, you had a book that was written by Max Horkheimer that separated thought into two types of theory, traditional and critical theories. And so this is the formal birth of critical theory. It didn't actually begin specifically in 1918 or 1920 when the Frankfurt School began. By 1937, it was outlined that critical theories were going to come into the world to understand society so that you might change it. So we come back to Marx's other big idea. They wanted to implement it. So now we've got Marxian conflict theory analysis being applied to avenues of culture. You've got the high culture, high society dictating what is good in life and how people should aspire and what they should hope to, what social mobility would look like, and convincing the poor, oppressed plebs that they have it good when in fact they have it bad, even though they like their lives. So you have to agitate them to do this. Critical theory became the tool to do that. We had a quote on the marquee a few minutes ago talking about that when you use science, the objective is to understand the truth of the thing, and when you use alchemy, the objective is operational success. In this case, science is traditional theory. The traditional theories were philosophy. They were science. They were things that cared about epistemic adequacy. They were the attempt to find truth to describe the world as it is and to understand it. Remember, there's this dichotomy. Are we going to understand the world or are we going to change it, right? So traditional theory was used to understand the world as it is. Critical theory was the other side. It was to understand how the systems that exist, the structures that exist, are failing people. You have to understand how they're failing people, not understand how they work, how they fail people. Traditional theories for understanding how they work. They work in tandem. You also have to have a normative vision. You have to know where you're trying to change society. In this case, it was not toward Marxism, but toward communism anyway, by other means, through changing culture. And you had to make a critical theory, by definition, has to be applicable to social activism. So you have to have these three ingredients or you're not dealing with a critical theory. So critical theory is born in 1937 as a means of bringing social activism to change the world according to our normative vision by picking at the scabs of where the structures and systems of society, institutions of society fall short of that normative vision. And by normative vision, again, I mean the pathway to the utopia. These ideas are very dangerous, but used in tandem, they still fall within this broad scope of modernism. Traditional theory still exists. The original critical theorists, for whatever their flaws in their thinking might have been, whatever their flaws in their objective might have been, were still bound by objective truth. They still thought that traditional theories and critical theories must be used in tandem to understand society and to advance progressively. In the 1960s, this is the subject of my book that Mr. O'Fallon mentioned, Cynical Theories. In the 1960s, we had a new line of thought blossom in the French kind of avant-garde philosophy scene, drawing off of art and literature that preceded it by a couple of decades. That's postmodernism. Postmodernism is playful by definition, and one of the main things that they want to do is play. They want to play with ideas. They want to take ideas apart. That's your deconstruction eventually. The postmodernists were highly influenced by a French school of thought that's been mostly discredited called structuralism, that believed that the ways that language is used in society has a lot to do with the structures that evolve in society. The way we talk, the way that we believe, the way that we interact with language and communicate meaning, structure society in some meaningful way. And the postmodernists grew skeptical of this in a particular way and said that what's really going on is that language is a vehicle of power. So with the postmodernists, we have two kind of main ideas that were kind of brought to the fore among many. It's a sprawling philosophical school of thought, or if we stretch the word philosophical a bit to do that, but it's a sprawling school of thought. The two main ideas are that objective truth, as a matter of fact, is inaccessible. As Richard Rorty, the American pragmatist kind of postmodernist, put it, the world might be out there, but the truth isn't out there. The more famous, most famous maybe postmodern philosopher Michel Foucault had a particular belief about truth. He thought that truth, knowledge, and power are the same thing. Knowledge and power are not related to one another. They are in fact the same thing, that the power applies itself through truth. So if you don't understand this about power, we can't understand words like diversity, inclusion, and equity. So for Foucault, the belief was that you have these statements. People call them truths. Somebody got to authenticate them as truths. Maybe they were scientists, maybe they were philosophers, maybe they were politicians, maybe they were journalists. Somebody had the privilege of saying these things are true and other things are false, and in particular for Foucault, these other things are crazy. They're mad. Those are to be completely thrown out. And he had a very pessimistic read of science as a result. He saw science as a process of applying power through claims on truth. People went to school, perhaps, or they worked with an existing scientist, and they learned the so-called methods of science. They learned how to authenticate truths as a scientist. But in fact, Foucault said this is a political process. The process of becoming a trained scientist has more to do with playing the political game in the social milieu in which scientists are considered important and in which they're educated than it has to do with anything else. So his underlying belief was, we have these claims about the world that are called truths or truth claims, and truths or truth claims might be true in reality, they might correspond to reality, or they might be false, but to worry about that is to miss the point that there was a political process that made them be considered so. And so he put a really thick wall between reality and our claims about truth. Truth is now on the other side of an impossible epistemic barrier. Truth becomes a cultural artifact. So the first real principle of postmodern thought is that truth and knowledge are cultural constructions. They are the product of a social system and the power contained within that social system and its operations. So now truth is power. Everything is power. We can't look to the world to find out if something is true or not, because power determined the method by which we will say, yes, this is true, and no, that is false, and that is right out, that's crazy. That's an application of power and nothing more. And that's where the fruitful analysis lies. He softened, just to be completely fair to Foucault, he softened later. Near the end of his life, he gave a series of lectures on his concept of biopower, and he was much more accepting of this. He still asserted that it was a method of applying power, but he was much more accepting of it than other, more tyrannical applications of power. But the most important thing was that he had introduced and loosed into the world a set of ideas where power no longer works the way that the critical theorists and the Marxists before them, and then many other people aside from that, believe. Power is no longer this weight, as he said, pressing down from above. It works through all of us like a grid, and the way that it works is through discourses. The ways things are spoken about. Not necessarily the words we use, but yes, the words we use. But the ways that we consider it acceptable to talk about a thing. So a medical discourse, for example, would be kind of doctor speak. Doctors talk about things in certain ways. Those are medical discourses. They write about things in certain ways. Those are medical discourses. And so the ways that it's considered acceptable to talk about certain topics became the locus of power. The dominant discourses were the conveyors of power, and it works through everybody. Everybody's a participant. And so now we have this idea that society is ordered by a conspiracy theory where everybody is an unwitting conspirator. And if you don't understand that this is how they think, that you don't understand that this is what systemic power means, you can't understand the shift from racism to systemic racism that we're facing today.
What does systemic racism mean?
Are the issues in the US and UK the same? What can I do to make a difference?
This is such an important question, Nissan.
Racism is not about just the times where you are called a bad word by somebody who's ignorant and doesn't like black people, right? That's prejudice.
Instead, it's about how society is really structured to keep people of color from positions of power, to make it more difficult, say, for communities of color to own property, to own homes, to advance in society.
The type of prejudice that black people face has been a broad range over the years, from being viewed as inadequate, from entire industries having absolutely no black representation at all, and the fact that we're viewed as dangerous or as criminals, which is all incorrect.
All white people are racist. So I put this up because I really want any white person in the room to know up front that this is what we're dealing with, that it's not going to be this coddling of white tears and what that looks like. We're not going to discuss, oh, maybe some of us have worked it out. No, you're always going to be racist, actually. So even when you're on your path to trying to figure out how to be a better human being, because I believe that white people are born into not being human, like that actually, instead of people of color and Black folks being dehumanized, that actually everyone is dehumanized on threat within white supremacy, that y'all are born into a life to not be human, and that's what y'all are taught to do, to be demons. So in this particular way, white people are all racist. So I just want y'all to know that up front.